The bell above the door didn't just chime, it announced a collision. My shop, usually a sanctuary of cool water and cut stems, was suddenly invaded by a scent that had no business among the peonies. Ozone, heated copper, the sharp electric smell of a storm trapped in fabric. I looked up from the arrangement of hydrangeas, and there she was. Lena filled the doorway, not just with her height, but with a presence that made the air feel suddenly thin. She rested one hand high on the frame, leaning in with a casual, predatory grace. The light caught the heavy silver ring on her finger, flashing a warning I was too distracted to read. In that second, the safety of my counter felt like a very fragile defense against the sudden, dangerous pull of her gravity. My life was built on a foundation of precarious math and rigid timing. Every morning started at 5 a.m., long before the sun hit the harbor, in a silent choreography of survival. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, packed Lily's lunch, with the crusts cut off exactly how she liked, and stared at the ledger on the kitchen table. The numbers never changed much. The mortgage, the shop rent, the utilities, they were fixed points in a universe that felt increasingly fluid. I moved money from one pile to another, a shell game played against my own anxiety. I was the architect of this stability, building walls of routine to keep us safe, to keep the chaos of single motherhood from washing us out to sea. Lily was the priority, the sun I orbited. Everything else was just maintenance. Then the lease on the old mechanic's garage down by the wharf was signed, and the ecosystem shifted. The town treated it like a scandal. In a place where everyone knew everyone's lineage back 3 generations, a stranger taking over the derelict industrial space was news. They said she was a sculptor. They said she worked with metal and fire. They said she kept to herself. I listened to the gossip while I wrapped bouquets for anniversaries and apologies, nodding politely while the women whispered about the noise and the strange lights at night. I didn't join in. I couldn't explain why, but the idea of that raw, industrial noise down the street felt like a heartbeat starting up in a body I thought had gone numb. I saw her properly a week after she arrived. I was sweeping the sidewalk, the morning mist still clinging to the pavement like wet wool. The garage door was rolled up. Inside, the darkness was punctuated by a shower of gold and orange sparks. Lena was there, a silhouette against the sudden violence of the light. She was welding something massive, her face hidden behind a dark mask, her body covered in heavy leathers. The sound of the grinder biting into steel whined through the quiet morning, a scream of effort that made my own skin prickle. It was a visceral, grinding roar that vibrated in my teeth. She moved with a competence that was terrifyingly attractive, wrestling the metal into submission with a stance that was wide and grounded. When she killed the torch, the silence that rushed back in was deafening. She pulled the mask off, shaking out hair that was matted with sweat, and for a second, across the empty street, she looked right at me. I froze, broom in hand, caught in the act of witnessing something private and intense. I turned away first, marching back into the safe scent of roses and baby's breath, my heart hammering a rhythm that annoyed me. I didn't have time for this. I didn't have the bandwidth for curiosity, let alone the heat that had just flared in my chest. Mark had called 3 times yesterday about the visitation schedule, his voice thin with the same old excuses about work conflicts. The tuition for Lily's dance class was due. The delivery van needed new tires. These were the things that mattered. These were the structural beams of my reality. A woman with strong hands and a jawline that could cut glass was a distraction, a luxury item I couldn't afford. I told myself to focus on the thorns I was stripping from the roses, ignoring the flush on my neck. But the universe has a way of laughing at plans. The phone rang at 2 p.m. It was a delivery order, a massive arrangement, something architectural and bold, to be delivered to the studio at the wharf. No card, just an address that I knew better than I wanted to. I stared at the order slip, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. I could have sent the part-time driver. I could have made an excuse. But the pull was already there, a magnetic current humming beneath the floorboards. I picked up the vase, the water sloshing dangerously, and walked out the door. The weekly night market was a humid, chaotic ritual that the town performed with religious fervor, a dense concentration of noise and light pressed against the black edge of the harbor. The air was always thick enough to taste, a heavy soup of frying calamari, spun sugar, and the briny, cold undertone of the ocean rising with the tide. I navigated the crush of bodies with Lily's small, sticky hand anchored firmly in mine, her excitement vibrating up my arm like a live wire. For her, this was magic, a labyrinth of treats and treasures. For me, it was a performance. I wore my, quote, zero smile like armor, nodding at neighbors, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the school board, while my internal battery drained with every forced interaction. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the constant, crushing weight of holding up the sky for a 7-year-old. We drifted toward the quieter edge of the market, away from the aggressive, bright lights of the food trucks, toward the artisan stalls, where the shadows were longer and the crowd thinned out. Lily stopped abruptly at a table laden with ceramics, her attention caught by the glossy, dark glaze of the pottery. I paused, grateful for the reprieve, and leaned against a wooden post, closing my eyes for just a second to listen to the ocean lapping against the pilings below. I felt the shift in air pressure before I saw the cause. The ambient chatter of the crowd seemed to dampen, swallowed by a sudden, heavy silence that existed only in my immediate radius. I opened my eyes, and she was there. Lena stood on the opposite side of the ceramics table, examining a rough-hewn mug with the same intensity she had applied to the steel in her garage. She looked different out here, stripped of the welding gear but still carrying the atmosphere of the workshop with her. She wore a leather jacket that was distressed at the elbows, open over a dark shirt, and even in the humidity of the market, she didn't look hot. She looked contained. The scent of her hit me instantly, cutting through the grease and sugar. It was cedar, sharp and clean, mixed with the faint metallic tang of ozone and old engine oil. It was a grounding, masculine scent that made my breath hitch in my throat. Lily, oblivious to the sudden tension coiling in my stomach, reached out to touch a delicate blue bowl. "Careful, Lil," I warned, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. "It's stronger than it looks," Lena said. Her voice was low, a textured rumble that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Lily, her expression serious and devoid of the condescending brightness adults usually reserved for children. Lily looked up at her, eyes wide, completely charmed. Lena corrected gently, a small, crooked smile touching the corner of her mouth. I stepped forward, the magnetic pull overriding my common sense. I needed to be closer. I needed to verify that the heat radiating from her was real. I said, the introduction feeling absurdly inadequate. Lena finally lifted her gaze to mine. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and unflinching. She didn't smile, but the attention she leveled at me felt like a physical caress. "I know," she said simply. She didn't offer an explanation, didn't pretend we were strangers. I reached for the blue bowl Lily had been admiring, needing something to do with my hands, which had started to tremble. At the exact same moment, Lena reached out to turn the piece, perhaps to show me the maker's mark. Our hands collided. The contact was brief, her knuckles brushing against the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. But the sensation was violent. It wasn't a spark, it was a jolt, a sudden, searing circuit closing between us. Her skin was rough, calloused from work, and incredibly warm. I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned, clutching my wrist against my chest. The air between us thickened, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. Lena didn't pull away. She left her hand on the table, her fingers resting near the bowl, and held my gaze. She saw the reaction. She saw the flush rising on my neck, the panic warring with the desire in my eyes. She said, her voice dropping an octave, intimate and knowing. I blurted out, grabbing Lily's hand a little too tight. I turned and fled, dragging a protesting Lily back into the safety of the crowd. I didn't look back, but I could feel Lena's eyes on my spine, a phantom touch that lingered long after we had left the market smells behind. The imprint of her hand on my wrist throbbed in time with my heart, a hot, secret brand that terrified me. It took 48 hours for my common sense to lose the war against my curiosity. I told myself it was professional courtesy. I told myself that as a business owner in a town that thrived on networking, I had an obligation to welcome the new tenant properly. I told myself a lot of things as I stood outside the corrugated metal door of the warehouse, clutching a potted staghorn fern like a shield. The excuse was flimsy. Welcome to the neighborhood gesture that was weeks late. But it was the only ticket I had. I knocked on the metal frame, the sound hollow and pathetic against the industrial hum coming from inside. There was no answer, just the continuous, rhythmic rasp of a file against metal. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, immediately crossing a threshold into a different climate. If my flower shop was a place of cool water and fragility, this studio was a cathedral of heat and permanence. The air inside was 10 degrees warmer than the street, thick with the dry, baked smell of a kiln firing at high temperature. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that cut down from the high, clear-story windows, suspended in the air like gold filings. It was chaotic but curated. Shelves lined with jars of glazes, stacks of scrap metal, and heavy wooden workbenches scarred by years of use. Lena was in the center of it all, her back to me. She was bent over a vise, working on a twisted piece of copper with a focus that felt almost religious. She wore a stained gray tank top that left her shoulders bare, revealing the sheen of sweat that slicked her skin. Muscles in her upper back shifted and coiled with every stroke of the file, a mesmerizing display of functional strength. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was simply working, and the raw honesty of it made my mouth go dry. She must have felt the draft from the door, because she stopped mid-stroke, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. She turned slowly, pushing a pair of safety goggles up into her damp hair. Her face was streaked with soot, and she stood with a stillness that contrasted the violence of the work she'd just finished. She didn't look surprised to see me. "I brought you a plant," I said, the words tumbling out too fast. I held up the fern, feeling ridiculous. "It's a staghorn. They like humidity and neglect. I thought it might survive in here." Lena wiped her hands on a rag that hung from her belt, the movement deliberate. She walked toward me, closing the distance until the heat radiating off her body hit me like a physical wave. She took the plant, her fingers brushing mine. No shock this time, just a steady, warm pressure. "It's perfect," she said, setting it on a workbench without looking away from me. "Thank you." "I see you're busy," I stammered, looking for an exit strategy now that I was actually here. My eyes drifted to the piece she was working on. It was a jagged marriage of rusted iron and translucent, delicate glass. The two materials shouldn't have worked together, one brutal, one fragile, but she had joined them in a way that looked seamless. I asked, stepping closer to the sculpture despite myself. Lena said, her voice low, stepping up beside me. We were close now, shoulder to shoulder. The metaphor landed heavy in the space between us. I looked at her, and she was watching my profile, her gaze tracing the line of my jaw. The air in the studio felt suddenly airless, the oxygen consumed by the kiln and the proximity of her body. I whispered. She murmured. She noticed the way I swallowed, the slight sheen of perspiration on my forehead from the studio's heat. It wasn't a question. She turned and grabbed a mason jar from a shelf, filling it from a cooler in the corner. She handed it to me, the glass slick with condensation. Drink. I lifted the jar to my lips, the water shockingly cold against the heat of the room. I drank greedily, a stray drop escaping the corner of my mouth and tracking down my neck. Lena watched the movement of my throat, her eyes dark and unreadable, tracking that single drop of water as it disappeared into the collar of my shirt. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just witnessed my thirst, and the intensity of her attention felt more intimate than if she had kissed me. I lowered the jar, breathless, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I should go, I said, my voice barely audible. Lily needs dinner. Sarah, she said, saying my name like it was a weight she enjoyed carrying. Come back. When you don't have a plant. I nodded, unable to form words, and retreated toward the door. Stepping back out onto the street felt like walking off the edge of the earth. The cool coastal breeze hit my flushed skin, but it didn't help. The heat of the studio and the heat of her gaze had settled deep in my marrow, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that my walls were beginning to crumble. I returned exactly 3 days later. I told myself I'd left my sunglasses on the workbench, a lie that felt thin even as I rehearsed it in the rearview mirror. The memory of the studio, the heat, the dust, the way she looked at me, had become a background noise I couldn't tune out. It hummed under the ordinary frequencies of my life, static, interfering with the clear signal of my routine. The door was unlocked. I stepped in, the late afternoon sun slicing through the high windows in thick architectural beams. It was quieter today. The grinder was silent. The only sound was the rush of water from the industrial sink in the corner. Lena was there, back to me again, scrubbing her hands. I stopped, unwilling to interrupt the ritual. The light caught the spray of water, turning the droplets into suspended diamonds. She was aggressive with the soap, scrubbing grease and metal filings from her skin with a rough sponge. I watched the muscles in her forearms flex, the mesmerizing competence of her hands as they worked. Then she shut the tap off. As she reached for a towel, her hand passed through a shaft of direct sunlight. The flash was blinding. Silver. Heavy, tarnished silver with a distinct braided rope pattern twisting around a central piece of sea glass. My breath stopped. It wasn't a gasp. It was a complete cessation of lung function. The world tilted on its axis. I knew that ring. I knew the weight of it, the way the silver felt cool and smooth against the palm. I knew it because I had the matching one tucked away in a small velvet box at the bottom of my underwear drawer. The only thing my grandmother, a woman who lived a loud, conventional life, had ever kept hidden. Lena said, turning around. She didn't look at my face. She looked at where my hands were clutched against my purse. The ring, I said. My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat and stepped forward, the magnetic pull now terrified and urgent. Where did you get that ring? Lena's posture shifted instantly. The easy, predatory grace vanished, replaced by a sharp, guarded tension. She covered her left hand with her right, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. Family heirloom, she said, her tone clipping the end of the sentence. Why? Because it's not just a ring, I whispered. I was close enough now to smell the soap on her skin, clean and industrial. It's a promise. My grandmother, she had the other one. She never wore it. She kept it in a box with a picture of a woman she called her best friend from a summer she spent here in the 60s. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sudden, crashing weight of history. Lena went still, searching my face for the lie. She didn't find one. Slowly, deliberately, she uncovered her hand. She held it out, palm up, fingers slightly curled. "My great-aunt Clara," Lena said softly, the name landing between us like a ghost. She was a sculptor too. She spent a summer here. She said she met the love of her life on this coast, but she had to go back to the city. She said they exchanged rings so they'd always be holding hands, even when they were apart. The air in the room condensed. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was gravity. It was the realization that the pull I felt toward her wasn't a glitch in my system. It was a legacy. Our bloodlines had been trying to find their way back to this room, to this heat, for 2 generations. "She never forgot her," I said, my voice trembling. "My grandmother. She used to look at the ocean like she was waiting for it to bring something back." "And here we are," Lena murmured. She took a step closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt like a homecoming. "The loop is closing, Sarah." She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. The history swirling around us was tactile enough. The realization that our grandmothers had hidden this fire, this connection, so that we could stand here in the light and feel it, it broke something open inside me. The fear of the town, of Mark, of the bills, it all felt small compared to the sheer, impossible magnitude of the ring on her finger. "I have the other one," I confessed, the secret feeling dangerous and liberating on my tongue. "I know," Lena said, and her gaze dropped to my lips. "I think you have a lot of things you've been keeping hidden." The implication hung there, sultry and undeniable. The ring was permission. It was validation that this consuming intimacy wasn't a mistake. It was an inheritance. Stepping out of the studio that afternoon felt like re-entering the atmosphere without a heat shield. The heavy, golden silence of the workshop, weighted with the dust of metal and the ghosts of our grandmothers, was instantly stripped away by the harsh, salty wind of the harbor. I carried the secret of the rings like a burning coal in my chest, a source of heat that was both comforting and terrifyingly unstable. But reality has a way of dousing even the brightest fires, and my reality was waiting for me in the form of a vibrating cell phone on the passenger seat of my van. It was Mark. Of course, it was Mark. The next 48 hours were a study in structural failure. The fragile equilibrium I had maintained for years, the careful balancing act of finances, parenting, and emotional repression, began to buckle. Mark wasn't just an ex-husband. He was an atmospheric condition, a low-pressure system that brought headaches and cold fronts. He called to say he couldn't take Lily for the weekend, again. He called to quote 47 the tuition payments for dance class, his voice thick with that particular brand of passive-aggressive concern that made my teeth ache. He asked if the shop was, quote, 48 in this economy, a question designed to undermine rather than support. The stress didn't manifest as anger. It manifested as a physical constriction. My shoulders climbed toward my ears, locked in a permanent shrug of defense. A tension headache took up residence at the base of my skull, a dull, rhythmic throb that synchronized with my pulse. I moved through the motions of my life, cutting stems, signing checks, making school lunches, but I felt brittle, like a dried hydrangea bloom that would shatter if anyone squeezed too hard. I was trying to handle it alone, the way I always had, the way I thought I had to. I was the strong one. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who didn't need anyone. But the ring on Lena's finger had opened a fissure in that logic. I kept thinking about my grandmother, hiding her heart in a velvet box for 50 years. I kept thinking about the look in Lena's eyes, unflinching, seeing right through my armor to the exhaustion underneath. The breaking point didn't happen in private. It happened in the frozen food aisle of the local grocery store, under the humming, merciless glare of fluorescent lights. I was reaching for a bag of peas when Mark rounded the corner. He wasn't supposed to be there. He lived 2 towns over now. Seeing him in my space, in my routine, felt like a violation. He looked good, rested, casual, which only made my own frayed edges feel more ragged. He said, stopping his cart. He scanned me, his eyes lingering on the dark circles under my eyes and the messy bun I hadn't had time to fix. "You look tired." "I'm fine, Mark," I said, my voice tight. "Just busy. The shop is busy." "Right," he said, a small, patronizing smile playing on his lips. He reached out and touched my arm, a gesture meant to be comforting, but it felt cold. It lacked the heat, the electric charge, the terrifying gravity of Lena's proximity. It just felt like a weight. "I'm just saying, maybe you should think about scaling back. For Lily's sake. You seem overwhelmed." The suggestion that my ambition was hurting our daughter was his favorite weapon. Usually I would have deflected. I would have smiled the capable mother smile and changed the subject. But the memory of the studio was too fresh. The contrast between this hollow, performative concern and the raw, silent intimacy I had felt with Lena was too sharp. "I'm not overwhelmed," I snapped, pulling my arm away. "I'm a single mother running a business. I'm exactly as whelmed as I need to be." People were looking. I didn't care. I abandoned the cart, left the peas, the milk, the bread, and walked out. I walked straight past the checkout, out the automatic doors, and into the parking lot. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the ignition. I didn't drive home. The apartment felt too small, too filled with the responsibilities I was failing to juggle. I didn't drive to the shop. The flowers felt too delicate, too demanding of a gentleness I didn't possess right now. My hands moved on the wheel with a mind of their own, guiding the van down the familiar slope toward the harbor. I needed something solid. I needed the smell of ozone and the heat of the kiln. I needed the one place where I didn't have to be the architect of everyone else's comfort. I parked the van haphazardly on the gravel strip outside the warehouse. I didn't check my reflection in the mirror. I didn't grab a potted plant as an excuse. I didn't have a delivery order. I just got out, walked to the corrugated metal door, and stood there. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was just thinking about the woman on the other side of the metal and the hope that she could solder me back together. I didn't knock. I didn't have to. The heavy metal door rolled up before my hand even touched the surface, as if the building itself was attuned to my frequency. Lena stood there, framed by the dim interior light. She wasn't wearing the welding mask this time. She was covered in a fine, pale dust, clay, not metal, that clung to her dark shirt like pollen. She took one look at me, at the flush high on my cheekbones, the tremor in my hands, the way I was holding myself together by sheer force of will, and she didn't ask a single question. She didn't say quote 58 quote or quote 59 quote. She just stepped aside, creating a space for me to enter, and then closed the world out behind us. The studio smelled different today. The sharp, metallic tang of ozone was gone, replaced by the damp, primal scent of wet earth and stone. It was a grounding smell, heavy and cool, sinking into my lungs and displacing the panic. Lena moved back to the potter's wheel in the corner, her movements fluid and unhurried. She gestured vaguely to a high wooden stool near the workbench. "Sit," she said softly. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation to stop vibrating. I sat. My knees were shaking, so I tucked my feet onto the rungs of the stool, wrapping myself into a tight ball. I watched her. She sat at the wheel, kicked it into motion, and slapped a lump of gray clay onto the center. The sound was rhythmic, a steady thrum, 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 that seemed to slow my own racing pulse. She wet her hands in a bucket of murky water and leaned forward, her forearms engaging as she pressed into the spinning mass. I watched the water run down her wrists, dark with slip, and felt a strange, vicarious release. Lena said, her voice low, blending with the hum of the wheel. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the clay, but she was speaking directly to my panic. If you don't get the core steady, the walls will collapse when you try to pull them up. It doesn't matter how strong the clay is. If it's off balance, the centrifugal force will tear it apart. I watched her hands. They were strong, capable hands, forcing the chaotic lump into a perfect, spinning cylinder. The metaphor landed hard. I had been spinning for years, trying to build walls on a foundation that was constantly shifting. I feel like I'm wobbling, I admitted, the confession slipping out before I could check it. My voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. I feel like the walls are getting too thin to hold the weight. Lena took her foot off the pedal. The wheel slowed to a halt. The sudden silence was thick, filled with the dust motes drifting in the slant of light. She didn't wipe her hands. She stood up and walked over to where I was perched. She stopped inches from my knees. I could smell the clay on her, the damp earth, and beneath that, the warm, distinct scent of her skin. She was so close that I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a steady, solid warmth that felt like a furnace against my chill. She looked up at me, her proximity dismantling my defenses, without saying a word. She said. Her voice was a rumble in her chest, deep and certain. She didn't touch me, her hands were covered in wet clay, but she leaned in, bracing her weight on the workbench on either side of my hips. I was trapped in the circle of her arms, held there by nothing but proximity and tension. I stopped breathing. The air between us was electric, heavy with unsaid things, charged with a consuming intimacy that made the rest of the world fade into gray static. I was centered. I was terrified. And I had never wanted anything more than for her to close that final inch of distance. Lena pulled back, breaking the circuit of her arms. She walked to the sink, the industrial water running loud as she washed away the gray slip. I watched her dry her hands, every movement deliberate, before she turned back. She didn't say a word. She simply twisted the heavy silver ring on her finger. It resisted for a moment before sliding free. She walked back to me and held it out. I opened my hand and she dropped the ring into my palm. It was heavier than it looked, a dense gravity of silver and glass. But what hit me first was the temperature. It was warm. It carried the heat of her skin, a stored thermal memory of her pulse. I closed my fingers over it, feeling the braided pattern bite softly into my palm. It was a tangible link, an anchor dragging the past into the present. Lena said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register. I looked down at the ring, my thumb tracing the sea glass. I whispered, the realization tasting like ash. Lena said gently. She leaned against the workbench. I said, looking up. The question hung in the dusty air. I wasn't living in the 60s. I was hiding because it was easier. I was policing my happiness, shrinking to fit the spaces Mark and the town allotted, calling it stability when it was just cowardice. I was treating desire like a structural flaw to be patched instead of the load-bearing beam it was. You don't need an excuse, Lena said. You just need to decide if the safety you've built is actually keeping you safe, or if it's just keeping you lonely. The truth cracked something open in my chest. The exhaustion weighing me down wasn't from work. It was from holding the door shut against the wind. I stood up. The movement was sudden, propelled by clarity. I took a step toward her, closing the gap. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was dry now, rough with the calluses of her trade. I slid the ring back onto her finger. It slid home with finality, like a bolt sliding into a lock. I didn't let go. My fingers lingered, wrapping around hers, thumb tracing her knuckles. Lena didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, catching mine in a grip that was firm and grounding. Her thumb pressed into the soft skin of my inner wrist, right over my pulse, which hammered a frantic rhythm against her skin. The air in the room vanished, replaced by a distilled tension that blurred my vision. We were standing on the precipice. The history of the rings, the weight of the grandmothers, the heat of the kiln, it all converged into this single point of contact. She breathed, and the sound of my name felt like a question I was desperate to answer. But the habit of retreat is a muscle memory that doesn't fade instantly. The magnitude of what she was offering, of being seen without filter, triggered a flare of panic. It was too much, too fast. I pulled my hand back, breaking the connection. The loss of contact was a physical cold snap. I stepped back, hitting the stool. I can't. Not yet. Lena didn't chase me. She just stood there, wearing the ring and the patience of a woman who knows that some structures have to come down before you can build anything new. The weather turned with the sudden, violent caprice of the coast. The sunlight that had been illuminating the dust motes vanished, snuffed out by a bank of charcoal clouds that rolled in off the harbor faster than I could track. The first drops hit the corrugated tin roof like buckshot, loud and startling, before the sky opened up completely. Within seconds, the rhythmic thrum of the rain became a deafening roar, a wall of white noise that isolated the studio from the rest of the world. The sound was absolute. It drowned out the distant traffic, the seagulls, and the nagging voice in my head that told me to leave. We were sealed inside a capsule of gray light and the smell of wet concrete. Lena moved immediately. She walked to the bank of high windows, reaching up to crank the heavy metal shutters closed against the driving wind. The gears groaned, a mechanical protest that was swallowed by the storm. As each shutter slammed home, the light in the studio dropped, shifting from the harsh clarity of afternoon to a dim, intimate twilight. The space suddenly felt smaller, the shadows stretching out from the corners to wrap around the workbenches. I stood frozen near the stool, watching the muscles in her back shift as she secured the last latch. The sensible part of my brain, the part that balanced checkbooks and made school lunches, was screaming that this was the moment to leave. The storm was a warning. But my feet were rooted to the concrete floor. The pull wasn't just magnetic anymore. It was gravitational. I looked at the line of her shoulders, the capability in her hands, and I realized that walking out that door into the cold rain would be the most unnatural thing I could possibly do. Lena turned back from the window. She wiped her hands on her thighs, her expression unreadable in the gloom. She started to say something, maybe an offer of an umbrella, maybe a polite dismissal. But the words died in her throat when she saw me. I hadn't retreated. I had stepped forward. I was standing in her space now, well past the invisible boundary of polite conversation. The air between us was no longer empty. It was thick, pressurized by the storm outside and the silence inside. I watched her eyes widen slightly, the pupils dilating in the low light until they were almost entirely black. Quote 83, she said, but the name wasn't a question this time. It was an acknowledgement. I'm done being careful, I said. My voice was steady, grounded by a sudden, terrifying calm. The walls are coming down. I closed the final distance. It wasn't a hesitant step. It was a surrender to the gravity. I reached out, my hands finding the waist of her jeans, gripping the belt loops to anchor myself. The contact was electric. Through the fabric, I could feel the heat of her skin, a radiating warmth that mocked the chill of the storm. Lena didn't flinch. Her reaction was immediate and instinctive. Her hands came up to cup my face, her palms rough and warm, her thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones with a reverence that made my knees weak. She looked at me for 1 second, a long, suspended heartbeat where she searched my eyes for any sign of hesitation. And finding none, she lowered her head. The kiss wasn't tentative. It didn't ask for permission. It confirmed a reality we had both been denying for weeks. It was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. When her mouth met mine, the sensation was like sinking into warm water after a lifetime of being cold. It was a release, a physical uncoiling of the tension that had been tightening in my chest since the moment I saw her welding in the dark. I made a sound, a low, desperate noise that was lost in the thunder, and pressed closer, eliminating the space between our bodies until I could feel the solid, steady rhythm of her heart against my chest. Her hands slid from my face into my hair, her fingers tangling in the strands, holding me there as if she was afraid I might vanish if she let go. The smell of her, rain, heat, and the metallic tang of the clay filled my senses, overriding the scent of flowers and bleach that usually defined my life. For a long time, there was nothing but the sensation of being consumed. The roughness of her working hands against the soft skin of my neck was a contrast that made my nerves sing. It was a sultry, grounding friction. We swayed slightly, locked together in the center of the dim room, while the rain hammered against the roof like applause. It wasn't just passion, it was relief. It was the feeling of a suture finally holding, of 2 disparate edges being pulled together to make something whole. I wasn't the architect here. I wasn't the mother, or the business owner, or the ex-wife. I was just Sarah. And for the first time in years, I was completely, undeniably seen. The morning light didn't bring the hangover of regret I had been conditioned to expect. Instead, it filtered through the high windows with a clarity that felt surgical, illuminating the floating dust and the quiet disarray of the studio. Waking up in that space, with the smell of cooled kiln bricks settled into my clothes, felt less like a mistake and more like the first deep breath I'd taken in a decade. I had to leave. Lily was with Mrs. Gable, and the school run waited for no one. But I didn't scramble. There was no shame in the way I gathered my keys, no hesitation in the way I paused at the door. Lena was leaning against the frame of the back room, holding a mug of coffee, her hair loose and messy. She didn't ask when I'd be back. She didn't need to. She just nodded, a silent, confident acknowledgement that the tether between us was now permanent, a steel cable buried deep under the water. Driving back to the routine felt different. The town looked the same, the bakery opening up, the gulls fighting over trash. But the frequency had changed. I wasn't just observing it from behind a glass wall of exhaustion anymore. I was in it. Back at the shop, the flowers were just flowers, not desperate attempts to beautify a cage. I moved through the morning rush with a new efficiency, my hands steady as I wired Gerbera daisies, the phantom weight of Lena's hands on my waist, keeping me grounded. When Mark called at noon, his ringtone didn't trigger the usual spike of cortisol. I answered on the second ring, wiping stem juice from my fingers. He started in immediately about the weekend schedule, his voice pitching up into that familiar whine of weaponized incompetence. He couldn't take Lily because of a last-minute project. a euphemism I knew meant he had better plans. In the past, I would have apologized. I would have scrambled to rearrange my entire life to accommodate his lack of planning, absorbing the impact so Lily wouldn't feel the jolt. Today, I just leaned against the counter, watching a bee hover over a bucket of sunflowers. I said, my voice cool and flat. There was a stunned silence on the other end. He wasn't used to resistance. He was used to a doormat. Plans? What plans? You can't just change the agreement. I'm not changing the agreement, I said, my voice hardening into something structural. I'm enforcing it. You missed your window. I'm not waiting around. I hung up before he could respond. The sky didn't fall. The shop didn't burn down. I just put the phone in my pocket and felt a fierce, quiet pride bloom in my chest. Allowing myself to be a person, not just a function, hadn't made me selfish. It had made me strong. That evening, I didn't go to the studio alone. I brought Lily. It was the final stress test of the new structure I was building. Walking down the wharf, Lily skipped ahead, excited by the industrial strangeness of the neighborhood, the noise of the harbor, the smell of salt and rust. When we rolled up the door, Lena was there, working on a new armature, sparks dying on the concrete floor. She stopped immediately, wiping her hands. There was no awkwardness. Lena didn't try to be a parent. She just treated Lily like a small, interesting human. She showed her how the clay recycling machine worked, explaining the mechanics with serious respect. I watched them from the workbench, the tall, dark-haired woman and my bright, curious daughter. And the fear I had been nursing finally evaporated. Lena looked up and caught my eye. She was wearing the ring. It caught the light, a flash of silver and sea glass that signaled a promise kept. I smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't the capable mother performance. It was just me. The secret history of our grandmothers wasn't a burden we had to carry in the dark anymore. It was the foundation we were building on. The bond was visible, tangible, and finally, it was ours. We stood at the open bay door as the sun set, watching the harbor turn purple. My hand rested naturally on Lena's arm, her muscle warm and solid beneath my fingers. The ring sat between us, no longer a hidden artifact of a love that couldn't survive, but a beacon for one that would. If this story of hidden legacies and second chances resonated with you, subscribe to follow the rest of the journey.